Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today, we're going to be going over another one of the traps on the trap tree, and that is Wake of Fire. Wake of Fire is a skill that has had very serious changes in the past couple patches. It's kind of hard to understate the number of changes that Wake of Fire has gone through. And when I say the number of changes, I mean, well, massive changes. First off, Wake of Fire has been increased. The damage has been increased pretty tremendously in one of the patches, although it never really saw much use, despite the fact that it got increased. It was still kind of pathetic, to be perfectly honest. Even after it was increased, there were other issues. So one of them was the fact that apparently it had a very large next hit delay. Next hit delay is basically where once a target has been hit by it, the target can't be hit again by it for a certain period of time. Depending on the skill, each next thing would have a different next hit delay, and this would cause the damage to drop dramatically because, of course, if you can only hit a target with something like once every certain number of seconds, then that does, in fact, make things more difficult for you to dish out more damage. However, basically, Wake of Fire's next hit delay has been completely removed at this point. It no longer has a next hit delay, and so it does a much more massive amount of damage than it did before. Number two is that negative resistance in the form of items never applied to traps. Traps, in general, were considered to be some sort of minion pseudo thing, and because they were a pseudo minion type monster, they didn't ever really have the right, what would you call it, setup to actually be a thing that would be affected by that. And the problem with that, of course, is that because they were not affected by negative resistance, they could not benefit from, items such as Flickering Flame, like the Dragon Shield, and so forth and so on, which would give you a huge amount of additional damage for the fire skills. However, all that has been fixed. So Wake of Fire is now affected by negative resistance. Wake of Fire no longer interferes with itself in the form of next hit delay. And on top of this, it no longer takes up the positions of elite monsters like it used to and cause less elites to spawn inside of a zone. It is actually very surprising that Wake of Fire has become extremely powerful now in terms of what it is capable of. When you use Wake of Fire now, it actually functions much differently than it did before, which is it dishes out a large amount of damage in a pattern. So as you can see, it's only 1,110 damage at the moment, even with max synergies and a pretty decent amount of plus skills. Let me put my equipment on real quick. There we go. So now I have my equipment on, and now it's up to 1,488, right? Doesn't sound like a lot in theory, and it doesn't really seem like a lot even when you use one of them. But the key is that you're using multiple. So what you want to do is you want to actually cast more than one of them, obviously. And the more that you cast, the more they multiply. And they fire multiple times, and they actually hit multiple times as well. As you can see, each one fires a arrow-like protrusion of fire, which will dish out damage to everything within its path. Since you can, of course, cast 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them before the sixth one disappears, you can have 5 of these going at any given time, which means we have 1,488 damage, and we multiply that, 1,488 damage times 5, which gives us 7,440 damage, basically per shot. Now, if we look at them, you can see how many times they shoot. So let me, of course, my minion had to cast one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 before they explode, right? So they get 5 shots. So we take that 7,440 and we multiply that by 5, and we get 37,200 per 5 traps, which isn't bad, but it can be increased even further in other ways, more plus to skills, more negative resistance, and things like that. You can also utilize the Fire Sunder now to break the fire immunities, which will definitely help. And this is a big issue with fire damage items. Notice this guy is immune to fire. I can do no damage to this guy because he is immune to fire. For this, you're going to need things like the Sunder Charm. You're going to need things like negative resistance in terms of Flickering Flame. Flickering Flame is a good negative fire resistance item. Fire Facets also helps. There's also a very interesting, easy to get item early on known as Obedience. Obedience has a pretty decent amount of negative fire resistance on it, if I remember correctly. Although, let me double check the amount because I don't remember right off the top of my head. Obedience is a rune word that's actually pretty cheap. It's just a co and a foul rune. Everything else is dirt cheap, and it has negative 25% enemy resistance on it, which can dish out some pretty nice damage as far as that's concerned. Now, once you have about negative 35% resistance and a fire sunder, that's usually more than enough to kill most monsters. But when it comes to traps, what you really want to do is you want to get them as high as you possibly can in terms of level. Another thing that's important to note is that when it comes to traps, your attack speed is actually the main consideration for how fast the ability actually goes out, not your cast rate. Cast rate is not associated with traps at all, and it's actually kind of silly. So if I cast my traps right now, you'll notice I got 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, right? Well, if I take off my weapons, my traps are going to go much slower. And obviously I can speed that up even further by using Burst of Speed. As you can see, I can really get the traps out then. And that allows me to apply them even faster. How fast you want to be able to cast your traps is up to you, of course, but there's definitely other things that you can be doing while your traps are doing their work. So a lot of the times when you go into a fight, you're going to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, cast your traps, and then start working your other skills to their advantage. Like, for instance, you might be using Fire Blast, you might be using it's Shock Web, or you might even be using Death Sentry, which is a pretty good mix as well, because then once one monster dies, you're going to get access to the Corpse Explosions, which are going to dish out pretty decent amount of damage as well on their own. A lot of the trap builds usually involve Death Sentry and putting that into the mix so that the Corpse Explosions are killing things even faster. This is one of the builds that only recently has become viable. I would definitely say that Wake of Fire is not something that was ever really viable before, although it did work fairly good in the early game. I will always say that. In the early game, it was always fairly good. However, now, in the early game, it is absolutely insane. And as a low-level assassin, you can pretty much just waltz through the entirety of normal difficulty with just Wake of Fire, which is kind of insane. All in all, there's really not a whole lot more to talk about with this skill. It's not the best when it comes to single target damage. This is important. But it is decent when it comes to AoE, just like field of damage, hitting all these targets at one time and dishing out massive amounts of damage to everything in its path. Because as you can see, it shoots 5 times. Each trap is 5 times, so that's 5 times 5, which is a pretty large amount of shots. Each shot or each fire triangle can hit everything in that area, and it can just dish out massive amounts of damage to a large number of monsters. If we were to do like a quick calculation on that, I'm sure we could find out an actual number, right? So we have 37,200 per trap, 5 traps, right? But let's say we're attacking 100 cows. Right? It's going to do that 37,000 damage to all 100 cows, which means we've got 3.72 million damage going out in an AoE pattern. Yeah, it's not very much to a single target, but it's a lot in terms of AoE damage, hitting everything in that big giant mass of cows. And that's really what Wake of Fire is it's a very, very good AoE ability. And thanks to the next hit delay changes, thanks to the negative resistance changes, thanks to the elite changes, it is now actually a viable build. You can actually build a fire trap assassin now. It does require a lot of plus to skills, trap skillers, things like that, torch, Annie, and so forth and so on. And you are going to need things like Flickering Flame with negative resistances and other negative resistance equipment, like maybe a Phoenix shield. But all in all, when you're finished, you will be looking at a viable character, which is surprising because Wake of Fire was never viable before the changes. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we're just talking about Wake of Fire. And as always, join me next time as I go over Wake of Inferno.